Hi, and welcome to this video where I'm going to be showing you how to actually construct this underskirt, which will be covered with the overskirt fabric you see in the background. And we're going to be using information I relayed to you in the previous video of this sewing series, which I will link in the description box down below, so you can go ahead and follow along. So with that said, let's get started. As you can see, I'm cutting out my underskirt from this lovely yellow silk charmeuse, so pretty. And we are cutting out the front of the skirt, which, as you can see, I'm opting for a single layer cutting method. And that is because I am working with silk charmeuse, which is notoriously slippery and hard to deal with when you're trying to mark it. So if you are working with a similar fabric, I recommend doing the single layer cutting method as well. Just be sure that along that center front line, you really mark it clearly and accurately, so when you go to flip your pattern piece, nothing gets too shifted so you can get a good cut from the fabric. And then I've gone ahead and marked with white wax tracing paper. Wax because I like the permanency of it, and white because the shade is perfect for the yellow charmeuse, not too dark that it's going to show through onto the fashion side of the fabric, but I can see what I'm working with on the underside. And you'll also notice that the hem, it is a little longer than my actual pattern piece. That's just a preference on my part. I've given myself an extra inch just in case I want to make the skirt a little longer, but the original stitching line is still marked, as you can see, with the white wax tracing. And also, I do like to add a little bit of extra length sometimes because with a fabric like this, I'm going to construct the skirt and then hang it overnight because the bias can drop. And so that little bit of extra length at the hem can help when I go to trim the skirt to ensure that I'll have an even hem to work with. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut the back skirt pieces, and then I'm going to go ahead and do a partial lining as well, which I will show you how to do momentarily. So now that I've cut out all my pattern pieces for my underskirt, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to creating a partial lining for my underskirt. And you may be asking if a partial lining is necessary and why not a full lining, that kind of thing. Well, I don't think a full lining is really necessary here because the underskirt as is serving as a lining for our overskirt, right? But you may want to give a bit of coverage in the northern regions of the skirt because we're going to have things like darts and our zipper tape on the center back seam exposed. So a partial lining will just sort of provide a nice little mask for that area. So how do we go and create our partial lining? Well, a first step is taking the skirt back piece. And if you'll recall from the previous video in which I showed you how to draft the underskirt, I mentioned that I was going to put a notch right here on that skirt back, center back seam that was about where the zipper was going to end, okay? So if I want to make sure that my partial lining is covering my zipper, then I'm just going to descend a little below that, and here I've gone about an inch below, okay, that notch that I made. And then from there, I've gone from that mark and just drawn a straight horizontal line on over to the skirt back side seam. And I've marked that as the partial lining guideline. Now this is not going to be the line we're using to cut out the partial lining. It's just a guideline. And the reason we're not using this line is twofold. Number one, it's actually creating a much longer length on the skirt back side seam than it is on the skirt back center back seam. And so we'd have a lopsided lining if we did that, and that wouldn't be aesthetically pleasing, right? And secondly, also, you'll notice that here, our guideline is intersecting the side seam at a rather acute angle. Okay, and usually you always want to have your lines intersecting at 90-degree angles because it's going to make for a much nicer appearance in the end. So this is what you can see I've done here. This is the line that I'm actually going to be using to cut out my partial lining. And there is the 90-degree angle intersection. So let me show you how I did that. First, I've just gone ahead on that center back seam, and from the waistline, I've measured down to the partial lining guideline, all the way down. And that's about 10 inches for me. It may be different for you. And then I've taken that measurement, and I'm going to go on over to the skirt back side seam. I'm going to measure that same distance. And that measurement actually, you'll notice, falls right about here, right where this line actually extends to, right here. But you'll see that I've actually drawn my curved line below that, about 1/4 inch below that. And that's because I have very curvy hips. Let's now use a euphemism here. I have large hips. So obviously, if you have fabric going over any heavily curved surface and you still want to maintain a hem that looks even, right? Where here, it's not curved at all, right? It's not so curvy back here. You want to add a little extra fabric just to give the appearance of an even hem, right? Just basic logic right there. So that's why I've drawn my line there instead. And remember, you can, if you have narrow hips, you probably won't need to even do this, but the larger hips you have, maybe you want to give yourself a little extra room. You can always trim away later, but you can't add on, right? So it couldn't hurt. And then all I've done is I've taken a curved ruler. You don't need one, you can eyeball this. And from about the midpoint of the partial lining guideline, I'm just going to try an angle from the midpoint there on up to the point I'm choosing to draw my curved line to. And so mine's here, right? And you're just going to go ahead and do that as I've done and try and make a 90-degree angle intersection, right? And then you will have your cutting line for your partial lining for your skirt back. And a thing to note, this is what I'm calling the cutting line. It should be enough to cover your zipper as well as whatever finishing technique you want to use along the cutting line. I may just serge mine, so it's going to stay the same length actually. But if you want to do a rolled hem or bias tape or something like that, take that into account in terms of the length you want to add here. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to create the partial lining on the skirt front. So now that we've created our partial lining piece for the skirt back, we want to do the same for the skirt front. And in order to do that, we're going to refer back to the skirt back piece. And the first order of business is to actually recall the measurement we used to get the partial lining guideline. And that was taken from the top of the center back seam at the waistline, we measured, all the way down to here, the horizontal straight line, the partial lining guideline. And for me, that was about 10 inches. And we're just gonna take that measurement and we're gonna transfer it to the center front right here, okay? And I've already gone ahead and actually drawn in the partial lining guideline on my center front, but this is where you would mark. And then you're just gonna, once again, take your ruler and draw a straight horizontal line across to the skirt front side seam. And once again, you'll have your partial lining guideline for the front. All right. Now, the only thing I'll mention is that if you tend to carry a bit of weight in your lower abdomen, just as, you know, I have more weight in my hips, that you may want to tack on a little extra room here, maybe another 1/4 inch or something, just once again to give you that extra ease of fabric to go over that area so you get the appearance of a level hemline along that partial lining. That's just something to make note of. Now for the actual side seam for the skirt front, we're going to refer to the skirt back again. And we're going to take the measurement on the skirt back side seam that extends from the waistline along that side seam down to the curved line that we drew for our partial lining. So this is going to be the actual cutting line for our partial lining. That's what we're measuring. Okay? And then you're going to take that measurement and you're going to transfer it to the skirt front side seam, measuring from the waistline seam down. And I've made a little dot already right here for that measurement. And that is where I'm going to curve the center front marking up to. Okay, so I'm gonna, once again, just as we did in the skirt back, I'm gonna use the partial lining guideline. I'm gonna try and extend from the midpoint of the partial lining guideline in the skirt front on up to the side seam of my marking right here, creating a 90-degree angle. And I'm gonna do that with a curved ruler. right like this, and try and get a good line that I'm pleased with, the curvature, just like so. And now we have our partial lining for our skirt front. We can use both these pieces, both these skirt pieces, to cut out our partial lining pieces from fabric, and we'll be ready from there to start constructing the skirt. So I've actually begun constructing the underskirt, and I just want to give a little overview of what I'm doing here. Now these are the skirt back pieces, and of course you can see things like seam finishing. I've just gone ahead and serged the seams, the side seams, just to give a bit of a nicer look. You can use whatever seam finish you wish, obviously. And I've gone ahead and pressed the darts toward the back, right? That's the general rule. And when I do my partial lining, those darts I will press in the opposite direction just to reduce on bulk. And here the interesting thing you will see is in the zipper area, right here. Now because I happen to be working with silk charmeuse, which is a bit tricksy to work with, you know, when you go to sew it, sometimes it moves all about under that zipper foot. And when you're inserting a zipper, that's really not a good thing to have happen. So we want to stabilize the area. And of course you can use something like fusible interfacing. That's perfectly acceptable, especially because this is an underskirt, and the fusible interfacing, which can tend to leave a ridge on the actual face of the fabric, won't be noticeable since it's an underskirt, right? But that's the reason I'm not going to be using a fusible interfacing, just because you can get that ridge. So I'm going to show you how to do a technique which really works well. Now, of course, we have both back skirt pieces aren't at all stitched together because I'm inserting an invisible zipper. And invisible zippers, the rule is that you want to insert them before you actually stitch the seam, because you can get a bubble if you do it the reverse way usually. So just a good tip there. So what I've gone ahead and done, just to flat out stabilize the actual fabric initially, which does wonders, is use some spray starch. And that whole little zipper area, I've just gone ahead, sprayed it with some starch, and then used a hot iron to press it, and it automatically gives it so much crispness. So when you go to put it under the zipper foot, it's not nearly as squiggly, right? So it's much easier to work with just by doing that. Then, hopefully you can see, I've gone ahead and taken some silk organza. I've taken a strip of silk organza that's about 1 inch wide and just as long, a little longer than my actual zipper will be, so that I have like maybe 1/2 inch over where my actual zipper pull will end. So this I've gone and basted right within the seam allowance. Hopefully you can see my little basting lines. And I haven't basted it on the seam allowance because this is a fabric that tends to mar easily. So I want to make sure I keep any holes I make in the fabric within the seam allowance and not on the actual visible part. So here it is from the front as well. You can see the basting threads. And this now not only has a lot of crispness and weight and stability, but it has a lot of strength. So it's actually going to prolong the life of the zipper, which is excellent, right? Especially in such a delicate fabric. So this is just a little technique that I want to show you in case you happen to be working with fabric that is also difficult to work with, and you want a technique that actually not only stabilizes the area, but uses a little bit of a couture touch just to make your garment a little more refined. So as you can see, I've assembled my underskirt and its partial lining. I inserted the lining initially using hand basting stitches along the waistline seam. And then I went ahead and machine stitched over that because I really want to secure the seam, because we are going to be adding our gathered overskirt on top of this, and we're going to be adjusting and maneuvering the fabric layers, and we just want to make sure we're not going to be malforming that waistline seam. So securing the seam with some strong stitching is always a good idea. I've also slip stitched my center back seam of my lining to the zipper tape here along both sides, and you'll notice that I left a good portion of zipper tape exposed because I don't want to get my precious lining caught in the zipper. That's always one of my biggest fears. And speaking of zippers, you may be wondering why I have a white one in my yellow fabric. Why not a yellow zipper? Well, initially I just didn't have a yellow zipper, and then I had a white one and I thought, well, since my overskirt is white and I'm inserting an invisible zipper, so only the white pull tab is going to be visible, it's going to be completely camouflaged, so it's not a big deal, in case you were wondering. Also, regarding the zipper, you may be asking why I've inserted it at such an early stage before I've even attached the overskirt or the waistband. Well, that's because I want my underskirt and my overskirt to move independently of one another. I want very airy, floaty quality. So if I anchor my overskirt in my underskirt's zipper seam, it's gonna diminish that a bit. So I'm basically constructing this skirt on its own, except at the waistline, right? That's where they're going to be attached. So until I get the overskirt attached with the waistband, I can't really do anything in regards to the waistband on the underskirt. So that's why we're going in this order. And because I want to make sure that when you sew in your zipper, you leave a smidgen of room below the waistline seam, probably about a scant quarter of an inch. Don't take your zipper stop all the way up to the waistline, because then you'll have real difficulties when you try and sew your waistband onto your skirt. Okay, either you'll create pucker or a bubble, or even worse, you just may not be able to get your sewing foot or needle into the area you need to if your zipper is too close to that waistline seam. I've also attached or anchored my partial lining to the side seams of my underskirt right at its hem, or where I've serged, just so it's not going to be floating around too much, right? So it's securely anchored in there. And then a final note, you'll see the hem is still unfinished, right? And that's because, as I mentioned, I want to hang this skirt overnight and wait and see what happens to the bias before I do anything to the hem. And in order for that to happen, I need to have my waistband attached so I can secure it to my dress form and get a proper guideline of how my actual skirt is going to fall on a human body. And other than that, we are pretty much done with the underskirt at this stage. And then we're going to move on to making the overskirt and the waistband. So I hope you join me for the next steps, and see you soon. Bye-bye.